The year was 1943, and Stalingrad had become a monument to the impossible. Not the grand intentional kind of monument with bronze statues and carved inscriptions, but the organic sort that grows from catastrophe, a sprawling necropolis of twisted steel and frozen flesh stretching across the Volga's western bank. The wind moved through the ruins with a sound that wasn't quite wind, carrying whispers that might have been imagination or might have been something worse. 300,000 German soldiers had marched into that city believing themselves invincible. Fewer than 90,000 stumbled out as prisoners, their eyes hollow with the knowledge that myths can die as thoroughly as men. The wreckage told stories in a language beyond words. A Panzer III sat embedded in what had once been an apartment building's third floor. Its turret twisted at an angle that defied physics, testament to an explosion so powerful it had launched 20 tons of steel like a child's toy. Tank treads lay scattered across frozen streets like the shed skin of metal serpents. Rifles stood planted barrel first in snowdrifts, makeshift grave markers for soldiers whose bodies had long since been buried by the endless white. The city bore Stalin's name, and in bearing it had become his proof. The German war machine that had crushed Poland in weeks, France in months, could be broken. The world had watched this breaking with something approaching religious awe. For 2 years, the Wehrmacht had seemed less an army than a force of nature, as unstoppable and impersonal as an avalanche. They had swept across Europe with such speed that mapmakers struggled to keep pace, redrawing borders faster than ink could dry. But Stalingrad had changed the equation. Here, in the frozen heart of the Soviet Union, the myth of Nazi invincibility had not merely cracked, it had shattered so completely that the sound of its breaking echoed from Berlin to Washington, from Tokyo to London. Soviet propaganda seized this victory with both hands and transformed it into something larger than military triumph. Posters appeared overnight in Moscow, showing the red flag flying over Stalingrad's ruins, with slogans declaring it the tomb of fascism, the graveyard where Hitler's ambitions came to die. Radio broadcasts carried the news east and west, north and south, each repetition adding layers of significance until the battle became less a historical event than a turning point in human destiny. For the soldiers of the Red Army, many of whom had spent 2 years retreating, losing, dying in numbers that defied comprehension, Stalingrad represented validation. They could win. They had won. And now, driven by that intoxicating knowledge, they surged westward with fury reborn. This was no longer the defensive war of 1941, when every kilometer surrendered felt like a knife twisted in the national gut. This was retribution. Soviet boots that had marched east in desperate retreat now marched west with the weight of vengeance in every step. Each village recaptured, each city liberated, each position retaken became a small payment on a debt written in blood across the Russian landscape. The soldiers spoke of it openly, in language raw with emotion. Revenge for mothers raped, for brothers hanged, for villages burned, for the collective trauma of 20 million lives disrupted by invasion. The war had become personal in ways that transcended politics or ideology. It had become animal, primal, a thing of the gut rather than the mind. The Red Army's morale climbed to heights unseen since the war's opening days, perhaps higher. In June 1941, the Soviet soldier had fought with the confidence of the unprepared, believing in his nation's strength without truly understanding the nature of the enemy he faced. Now in February 1943, he fought with something more dangerous than confidence. He fought with the proven knowledge that the enemy could bleed, could break, could die in the snow like any other man. That knowledge transformed troops. Veterans who had survived the grinding horror of the previous 2 years found themselves mentoring fresh conscripts with the authority of men who had stared into hell and walked away. The new recruits arrived at the front with eyes bright with the promise of Stalingrad, eager to add their own chapters to the story of German defeat. But wars are not won by morale alone, and the Soviet High Command understood this even as they harnessed the emotional surge. The Voronezh Front and the Southwestern Front, under the command of generals who had learned their trade through brutal trial and error, prepared for offensives designed to exploit what appeared to be the Wehrmacht's imminent collapse. General Golikov, his reputation enhanced by his role in recent operations, studied maps with the intensity of a man who sensed history's hand on his shoulder. General Vatutin, commanding forces that had helped grind the Germans down at Stalingrad, prepared his troops for the next phase with methodical care. Their orders came from Moscow with Stalin's impatience embedded in every word. Pursue, attack, liberate, crush, give the enemy no time to recover. The plan possessed elegant simplicity. German forces in southern Russia appeared disorganized, scattered, vulnerable. Intelligence reports filtered through the optimism that victory breeds suggested an army on the verge of disintegration. Soviet commanders saw an opportunity to accomplish in weeks what might otherwise take months. The complete destruction of Wehrmacht forces in the south, opening the path to Ukraine and beyond. The snow that had been Germany's enemy would become the Soviet Union's ally, slowing any organized retreat while allowing the Red Army's winter-hardened troops to maintain their momentum. T-34 tanks, designed for exactly these conditions, would lead the advance. Infantry would follow in their wake, consolidating gains, securing supply lines, ensuring that liberation became occupation, became permanent control. February arrived with temperatures that could kill an exposed man in minutes, but the offensive launched regardless. Soviet forces moved with confidence bordering on recklessness, a human tidal wave flowing westward across the frozen steppe. The advance measured itself not in meters, but in kilometers, not in hours, but in days. Kursk fell, its German defenders retreating rather than standing to fight. Belgorod followed, abandoned with a speed that seemed to confirm every optimistic assessment. City after city, town after town, the pattern repeated. Soviet forces arrived to find Germans withdrawing, positions surrendered, victories achieved with minimal resistance. Something in this pattern should have troubled the advancing commanders, but the euphoria of winning proved intoxicating enough to cloud judgment. When soldiers reported that German retreats seemed unusually orderly, that equipment was being evacuated rather than destroyed, that rearguard actions showed more discipline than desperation, these observations got filed away as curiosities rather than warnings. The prevailing narrative was too powerful, too emotionally satisfying to question. The Germans were beaten. They were running. All that remained was to chase them down and finish the work that Stalingrad had begun. On the maps in Soviet headquarters, red arrows pointed west with beautiful consistency, each one representing divisions, armies, entire fronts moving in concert toward objectives that seemed increasingly achievable. Logistics officers struggled to keep supply lines functioning across hundreds of kilometers of winter landscape, but their concerns got buried beneath the urgency of maintaining momentum. Tank commanders burned through fuel reserves at rates that would have alarmed peacetime accountants. But this was war, and war had its own accounting system, where speed mattered more than efficiency. Infantry marched until their feet bled, then marched further, because the enemy was running, and running enemies must be chased. The next jewel on the map gleamed with particular significance. Kharkov, Ukraine's second-largest city, sat at the intersection of rail lines that made it strategically invaluable. Its factories had produced tanks and aircraft before the war. Under German occupation, they had been repurposed to serve the Wehrmacht's needs. Recapturing Kharkov would strike both a practical and symbolic blow. Practical because of its industrial and transportation value, symbolic because its liberation would demonstrate that even major urban centers could be wrested from German control. As February progressed, Soviet forces closed in on the city with expectations running high. Kharkov would fall. Of this there seemed little doubt. But doubt, dismissed and ignored, had already begun whispering in the frozen forests south of the advance, where German forces were moving with purpose that contradicted the narrative of collapse. If Soviet commanders had possessed the ability to see beyond their own optimism, they might have noticed the pattern emerging in the German retreat. Bridges were being destroyed methodically, not frantically. Supply depots were being evacuated completely rather than partially abandoned. Units that disengaged from combat did so in good order, maintaining formation integrity, communicating with adjacent forces, behaving less like a broken army than like chess pieces being deliberately repositioned. The Wehrmacht wasn't fragmenting, it was consolidating. And in the command centers where German officers planned their next moves, a name had begun circulating with the weight of hope in desperate times. Manstein. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, architect of the Crimean victory, one of the few senior commanders whose reputation had not been permanently tarnished by the Eastern Front's brutal mathematics. Manstein had been given command of Army Group South with instructions that bordered on the impossible: stabilize the situation, prevent total collapse, salvage something from the catastrophe that Stalingrad had created. He had studied the maps, assessed the forces available to him, and seen what others had missed. The Soviets were advancing too fast, stretching their supply lines too thin, exposing their flanks with the confidence of an army that believed itself unopposed. Manstein saw this not as a crisis but as an opportunity, the kind that appears perhaps once in a campaign if a commander possesses both the vision to recognize it and the courage to act. The Soviets expected continued retreat. They anticipated disorganization, demoralization, defeat internalized to the point where meaningful resistance became impossible. What they did not expect, what their intelligence had not prepared them for, what their optimism had blinded them to seeing, was the possibility that German retreat might be strategic rather than desperate, that the Wehrmacht might still possess the capability to strike back with devastating force. In his headquarters, Manstein assembled his staff and began explaining a plan that transformed defensive collapse into offensive opportunity. His fingers traced lines on maps that to less imaginative minds represented only the Soviet advance. But Manstein saw beyond the present moment into the near future, into the geometry of converging forces and exposed flanks. He saw the Red Army as a boxer who had landed a magnificent punch and now overextended himself, reaching for another, leaving his body unprotected, vulnerable to a counter that might end the fight. The metaphor appealed to Manstein's systematic mind. War as physics, as mathematics, as problems with solutions waiting to be calculated by commanders with sufficient nerve. The plan required resources that seemed barely available. Panzer divisions that had been battered in previous fighting would need to be quickly refitted, re-equipped, repositioned. Elite SS units that had been scattered across the southern front would need to be concentrated, focused into a spearhead capable of punching through Soviet lines. Manstein needed speed, surprise, and troops with the discipline to execute complex maneuvers under conditions that would test even veteran units. He needed, above all, the courage to give ground deliberately, to retreat in ways that would draw the Soviets deeper into the trap he was constructing. Hitler, in Berlin, had spent the weeks since Stalingrad oscillating between rage and despair, issuing contradictory orders that reflected his psychological state more than military reality. Stand fast, never retreat, hold every position to the last man. These dictates, which had contributed significantly to the Stalingrad disaster, represented Hitler's fundamental misunderstanding of military operations, his belief that will alone could substitute for realistic assessment. Manstein, navigating the treacherous waters of Hitler's approval, presented his plan with a combination of confidence and deference that the Führer's unstable ego required. The key was framing retreat not as weakness, but as maneuver, not as loss of nerve, but as battlefield cunning. The forces began assembling in the frozen landscape south of the Soviet advance with a secrecy that required absolute discipline. SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, Totenkopf. These were not ordinary units, but formations with reputations that preceded them, combat records that mixed undeniable effectiveness with documented atrocity. Their soldiers wore the runes and lightning bolts of the Waffen-SS, marks that identified them as the ideological core of Nazi military power. They were fanatics, yes, but fanatics with training that exceeded standard Wehrmacht units, equipment that often received priority allocation, and a willingness to fight with intensity that made them valuable in exactly the kind of desperate situation Manstein faced. The Tiger tanks arrived from repair depots and reserve formations, their 60-ton bulk making them nightmares to transport, but devastatingly effective once in position. Each Tiger represented a mobile fortress, its 88mm gun capable of destroying Soviet T-34s from ranges that made counterfire nearly impossible. Ammunition trucks followed, then fuel convoys, then the infinite logistics tail that modern warfare demanded. Supply officers worked around the clock, coordinating movements that had to appear random to Soviet reconnaissance, while actually following precise schedules designed to position forces for maximum impact when the counterattack began. Manstein imposed strict radio silence on mobile formations, knowing that Soviet intelligence monitored German communications with increasing sophistication. Orders traveled by motorcycle courier and staff car, a slower method, but one that denied the enemy electronic intelligence that might reveal the trap before it could close. Tank crews were briefed on their objectives without being told the larger plan, compartmentalization that reduced the risk of compromising information falling into enemy hands. The Germans were relearning lessons they had taught others in 1940. That surprise could multiply effectiveness, that the unexpected could shatter confidence, that armies fought with their minds as much as their weapons. The landscape itself became part of the plan. The frozen terrain that had so punished German forces during their advance now worked to their advantage during this calculated retreat. Snow covered the movement of armored formations. Winter reduced Soviet air reconnaissance to sporadic efforts. Cold sapped the effectiveness of pursuing forces while Germans used the respite to reorganize. Manstein studied weather reports with the attention most generals gave to enemy dispositions, timing his movements to coincide with conditions that would mask preparations, while not preventing operations once the counterattack launched. Soviet forces, unaware of the machinery being assembled in their rear, continued pushing west toward Kharkov with the momentum of an avalanche that believed itself unstoppable. The advance had acquired its own logic, its own internal justification that required no examination. Every victory confirmed the narrative. Every captured city proved the thesis. Every German withdrawal validated the assumption of enemy collapse. The Red Army had become a machine-consuming territory, transforming the color of maps from gray to red with satisfaction that bordered on intoxication. But intoxication, however pleasant, reduces awareness of danger, and the Soviet advance was becoming dangerously drunk on its own success. Supply lines that should have been shortened were instead lengthening with every kilometer gained. Artillery that should have remained close to forward elements instead lagged further behind, unable to keep pace with the rapid advance. Infantry that should have been protecting the flanks of armored spearheads instead got dispersed across the landscape, holding captured positions rather than concentrating for mutual support. The Red Army was achieving the kind of operational success that creates tactical vulnerability, spreading itself across the Ukrainian winter like butter scraped over too much bread. Kharkov itself sat on the horizon of Soviet ambitions like a prize waiting to be claimed. Intelligence reported that German defenders in the city were preparing to evacuate, that resistance would be minimal, that liberation would come with minimal cost. These reports fit so perfectly with expectations that nobody questioned their accuracy too closely. Soviet tank commanders planned their victory parades even as their vehicles rolled toward the city. Infantry officers rehearsed the speeches they would give to grateful civilians. Political officers prepared proclamations celebrating the liberation of yet another Soviet city from fascist occupation. On February 16, 1943, advance elements of the Red Army entered Kharkov's outskirts and found exactly what intelligence had predicted: minimal resistance, retreating Germans, positions being abandoned with haste that suggested panic. The tanks rolled into city streets decorated with the scars of previous fighting, their treads clattering on cobblestones as crews scanned buildings for threats that never materialize. Infantry followed, weapons ready but unused, moving through districts where fires still burned from German demolitions, but no defenders remained to contest the advance. By evening, the hammer and sickle flag flew over the city's administrative center, red fabric snapping in the winter wind as Soviet soldiers celebrated liberation. The satisfaction of this moment overwhelmed any instinct for caution. Kharkov had been retaken with such ease that it seemed to validate every optimistic assessment, to confirm that the Wehrmacht truly was falling apart, that the road to complete victory lay open and inviting. Officers sent jubilant reports back to their commanders, describing the city's capture, emphasizing the lack of resistance, noting with professional satisfaction how German forces had simply melted away rather than standing to fight. Moscow received these reports with Stalin's grim pleasure, another data point confirming that the initiative had permanently shifted to Soviet hands. But there were observers. Veteran soldiers whose survival instincts had been honed by 2 years of brutal fighting, who felt something wrong in the ease of Kharkov's capture. These men, their faces weathered by exposure and experience, looked at the abandoned German positions and saw order where there should have been chaos. They noted that equipment had been removed rather than destroyed, that demolitions had been selective rather than comprehensive, that the German retreat had possessed the character of a planned withdrawal rather than a rout. One sergeant, studying an abandoned defensive position, commented to his lieutenant that the Germans had left with unusual care. The lieutenant, young and eager and convinced of imminent victory, dismissed the concern with the confidence of someone who had never experienced reversal. In command posts throughout the Soviet advance, the same pattern repeated. Junior officers raised questions about flanks that seemed exposed, about supply lines stretching to breaking point, about the unusual orderliness of German retreats. Senior officers, caught up in the momentum of success and under pressure from Moscow to maintain the offensive's pace, brushed aside these concerns with varying degrees of patience. The Red Army had won at Stalingrad. It was winning now. Questions that might interrupt that winning were unwelcome, inconvenient, professionally risky for those who raised them too insistently. Golikov, at his headquarters, reviewed maps that showed Soviet forces deep into Ukraine, arrows pointing west toward objectives that seemed increasingly achievable. The capture of Kharkov represented a significant milestone, both strategically and symbolically. His forces had achieved in weeks what might have taken months in previous campaigns. If there were warning signs of overextension, they got lost in the forest of positive indicators, drowned out by the chorus of success. The general who raises alarms during victory risks appearing timid. The general who expresses confidence during advance gets validated by continued success. Golikov, like his counterparts across the front, chose confidence. Meanwhile, in German headquarters far to the south, Manstein received reports of Kharkov's fall with satisfaction that would have alarmed Soviet observers had they understood its source. The city had served its purpose as bait, drawing Soviet forces deeper into the salient that would become their trap. Every kilometer the Red Army advanced westward was a kilometer further from secure supply lines, a kilometer more exposed to counterattack, a kilometer deeper into the jaws that were preparing to snap shut. Manstein's staff worked through the night refining timetables, coordinating movements, ensuring that when the blow fell, it would land with maximum force at the point of maximum Soviet vulnerability. The SS Panzer divisions completed their repositioning during the third week of February, moving into assembly areas south of the Soviet advance with discipline that minimized detection. Tank crews performed final maintenance checks, replacing worn track links, calibrating gun sights, ensuring that every vehicle would be mechanically reliable when the offensive began. Infantry battalions drilled on assault tactics, rehearsing the coordination between armor and foot soldiers that made blitzkrieg effective. Artillery units calculated firing solutions for targets that didn't yet know they were targets, preparing the coordinates that would guide shells onto Soviet columns when the moment arrived. February 18th arrived cold and clear, the kind of winter day where sound carried for kilometers and visibility stretched to the horizon. Soviet forces in Kharkov consolidated their hold on the city, establishing command posts in buildings that still smelled of German occupation, setting up supply depots and warehouses where Wehrmacht quartermaster stamps still decorated inventory sheets. Soldiers explored their new conquest, discovering wine cellars and food stores that German forces had lacked time to evacuate completely. The mood was celebratory, relaxed, the tension of combat giving way to the relief of accomplished objectives. That evening, as darkness fell over the Ukrainian steppe, German tank engines began their startup procedures in staging areas concealed by terrain and darkness. The sound they made was deep and mechanical, a bass rumble that spoke of displacement and power, 60-ton machines stirring to life with purpose. Crews conducted pre-combat checks by flashlight, testing radios, verifying ammunition loads, running through checklists with the thoroughness that separated professional soldiers from enthusiastic amateurs. Officers briefed their subordinates on final details, emphasizing timing, coordination, the absolute necessity of maintaining formation integrity during the attack. In Kharkov, Soviet soldiers settled in for the night unaware that the Germans they believed to be in retreat were instead massing for counterattack. Guard posts were established with the routine of an army that had grown accustomed to occupation rather than combat. Supply convoys continued moving west, their drivers confident that the roads they traveled were secure, that the front had moved beyond them, that danger lay ahead rather than on the flanks. Intelligence officers compiled reports emphasizing continued German withdrawal, noting movements that seemed to confirm the pattern of collapse rather than recognizing them as the repositioning they actually represented. Manstein, in his command post, reviewed the final disposition of forces with his chief of staff, discussing details with the calm of a man whose plan had reached the point where further adjustment was impossible. The die had been cast, the pieces were in position, the trap was set. All that remained was to spring it with the timing and violence that would turn Soviet triumph into catastrophe. He retired for a few hours of sleep, the sleep of a commander who had done everything possible to prepare, and now could only wait for dawn to reveal whether calculation would be vindicated by reality. The Soviet soldiers sleeping in Kharkov that night, in requisitioned buildings and improvised barracks, in the city they had just liberated and believed secure, could not know that winter was about to show them a face they had not anticipated. They had seen winter as ally, the force that had ground down German invaders and enabled Soviet victory. They were about to learn that winter served no nation, acknowledged no loyalty, and that in war the elements cared nothing for the color of uniforms or the justice of causes. Winter was preparing to demonstrate a lesson written in blood across the centuries of warfare, that the army which believes itself victorious is most vulnerable to the unexpected, and that pride, however justified, becomes lethal when it blinds soldiers to approaching danger. The wind picked up after midnight, driving snow across the steppe in waves that reduced visibility to meters. German tank crews, hunched in their vehicles awaiting orders, felt the cold seeping through steel and clothing, numbing exposed skin, making each breath an effort. But they had been cold before, had learned to function despite physical discomfort, had developed the mental toughness that separated formations that could fight in winter from those that merely survived it. The SS troops, indoctrinated with ideology that treated hardship as test and suffering as validation, wore the cold like a badge of honor. They were ready. They had been ready. And now, as February 19th dawned gray and frozen over the Eastern Front, the moment they had prepared for arrived with the simplicity of a clock striking the hour. The order transmitted through command channels at 600 hours contained just one word, but that word carried the weight of months of planning, weeks of preparation, days of positioning: Angriff, attack. From assembly areas south of the Soviet advance, German armored columns surged forward with the coordinated violence of a predator's pounce. Tank tracks bit into frozen earth. Engines roared at full throttle. Gun barrels traversed toward targets identified in pre-dawn reconnaissance. The counteroffensive had begun, and with it, the transformation of Soviet victory into the opening act of catastrophe. The Red Army's advance into Ukraine, which had seemed like the triumphant march of liberation, was about to reveal itself as something else entirely. A journey into the jaws of a trap designed by one of history's most ruthless strategic minds, a trap that would turn snow red and make winter remember why men fear it. Word count, 4,982. Remaining for part 1, 100, or 900 words to reach 6,800 to 7,000 target, continuing immediately. The first Soviet units to encounter the German counterattack were reconnaissance elements positioned on the southern flank of the advance, small formations tasked with monitoring rear areas that command had deemed secure. These soldiers, cold and tired from weeks of continuous operations, occupied positions that had been hastily prepared, trenches scratched into frozen earth more as administrative requirement than genuine defensive measure. Nobody expected attack from the south. The Germans were retreating westward. Everyone knew this. Intelligence had confirmed it. And besides, the Soviet forces controlled the territory through which any counterattack would have to come. The appearance of German tanks on the horizon at 0630 hours therefore registered initially as confusion rather than alarm. The commander of a forward observation post, scanning the landscape with binoculars in the gray pre-dawn light, saw movement that his mind tried to categorize as friendly forces despite the evidence of his eyes. Tank silhouettes that were wrong for T-34s, moving in formation, too precise for retreating forces, approaching with speed that suggested purpose rather than flight. He reached for his radio handset, awareness crystallizing into urgency as the sound of tank engines carried across the snow, growing louder with each second. His transmission, crackling with static and tension, contained information that Soviet command was unprepared to process. German armor and strength, advancing rapidly from the south, contact imminent. The response from higher headquarters reflected the cognitive dissonance that accurate intelligence creates when it contradicts established narrative. Are you certain? Could these be isolated units? How many tanks exactly? The questions came rapid fire, each one revealing the difficulty of accepting that the situation had fundamentally changed. The observation post commander, watching through his binoculars as the German formation resolved into clearer detail, counted vehicles with rising dread. Not a raid, not a spoiling attack. This was assault in strength, coordinated movement of what appeared to be multiple battalions, perhaps an entire division, armor supported by mechanized infantry and self-propelled guns. His final transmission, sent moments before German artillery opened fire on his position, contained 3 words that would be repeated across the Soviet front in the coming hours. 3 words that marked the end of one phase of the campaign and the beginning of another. They are attacking. The German assault struck the Soviet flank with violence that shocked even veteran units accustomed to the Eastern Front's brutality. This was not the tentative probing of a weakened force, but the hammer blow of an army that had rediscovered its strength, concentrated its resources, and aimed them at a point of maximum vulnerability. Panzer IVs and Tigers led the advance, their guns engaging Soviet positions from ranges that made effective return fire nearly impossible. The Tigers, especially with their thick frontal armor and powerful 80 mm guns, moved across the battlefield like medieval knights armored against lesser weapons, destroying T-34s with single shots that turned Soviet tanks into funeral pyres. Behind the armor came the SS Panzer Grenadiers, mechanized infantry mounted in half-tracks that kept pace with the tanks, ready to dismount and assault any position that threatened the advance. These troops fought with intensity that mixed training with fanaticism, tactical skill with ideological fervor. They had trained for exactly this kind of operation: rapid breakthrough, exploitation of success, maintaining momentum regardless of casualties. The SS divisions had been given the spearhead role, not just because they possessed good equipment, but because their commanders knew they would push forward even when prudence suggested caution, that their political indoctrination made them willing to take risks regular Wehrmacht units might hesitate to accept. Soviet forces caught in the path of this onslaught found themselves facing a tactical nightmare. Their positions, oriented to defend against threats from the west, offered little protection against attack from the south. Anti-tank guns that might have been devastating if properly positioned were useless, their fields of fire blocked by terrain or friendly positions. Artillery, which should have been the great equalizer, was scattered across the landscape, unable to concentrate fires on the rapidly moving German columns. Tank units that might have counterattacked were dispersed. Many vehicles low on fuel or ammunition after weeks of continuous advance, maintenance deferred in the urgency of exploitation. The Soviet chain of command, optimized for offense rather than defense, struggled to respond to the crisis with appropriate speed. Orders that should have taken minutes to transmit and execute instead consumed hours, as the bureaucratic machinery of military hierarchy ground through its procedures. Unit commanders who recognized the immediate danger and attempted to react independently often found their initiatives contradicted by orders from higher headquarters that had been composed hours earlier, based on situations that no longer existed. The Red Army, so effective when advancing against a retreating enemy, discovered the terrible difficulty of shifting from offense to defense while under heavy attack. By mid-morning, the German penetration had reached 15 kilometers deep, a wedge driven into Soviet positions that threatened to split entire armies. Radio intercepts picked up by German intelligence units revealed the growing panic in Soviet communications, the requests for reinforcements that couldn't be provided, the orders to counterattack that units lacked the strength to execute. Manstein, monitoring these reports from his command post, allowed himself satisfaction rare for a commander of his temperament. The trap was closing exactly as planned, the Soviets reacting exactly as predicted, their overextension transforming from advantage to fatal liability. The northern pincer of the German assault launched several hours after the southern attack to maintain surprise and prevent Soviet forces from reorienting to meet both threats simultaneously, struck with equal violence against positions even less prepared. Here, the Soviet troops had advanced so far west that many units believed themselves completely secure, their attention focused forward rather than on flanks that seemed protected by the depth of the advance. The appearance of German armor from the north therefore achieved complete tactical surprise, units being overrun before they could organize coherent defense. Command posts captured with officers still studying maps that showed Germans retreating rather than attacking. The two German pincers, driving toward each other through Soviet-held territory, began to envelop the forward elements of the Red Army advance in a classic Kessel Schlacht, the cauldron battle that German doctrine had perfected during the war's earlier campaigns. Soviet units that had spent weeks pushing west now found themselves surrounded, cut off from supply lines, isolated from supporting forces. The advance that had seemed so promising, so filled with the momentum of victory, had become in a matter of hours a disaster of encirclement. The Soviet 40th Army's command post occupied a requisition schoolhouse 12 kilometers behind what had been, until 2 hours ago, a secure front line. General Golikov stood over a map table surrounded by officers whose faces reflected the cognitive dissonance of men trying to process information that contradicted everything they believed about the situation. Reports continued arriving, each one worse than the last, painting a picture that Golikov's mind resisted accepting, even as the evidence mounted beyond denial. German forces attacking in strength from the south. Additional formations striking from the north. Forward units requesting permission to withdraw. Rear echelon convoys reporting contact with enemy armor. The neat red arrows on his map, which yesterday had pointed confidently westward toward victory, now seemed to mock him with their obsolescence. His chief of staff, a colonel whose competence had been proven through 2 years of survival in positions where incompetence meant death, attempted to impose order on chaos through the familiar rituals of military procedure. Unit strength reports. Enemy force estimates. Assessment of available reserves. The colonel's voice remained steady, professional, but his hands betrayed him, fingers trembling slightly as they moved colored pins across the map in configurations that revealed the magnitude of disaster taking shape. The 3rd Tank Army, which had been the spearhead of the advance, was now cut off, surrounded, fighting for survival rather than pushing toward objectives. The 69th Army reported its southern flank collapsed, units streaming north in disorder that suggested rout rather than tactical withdrawal. Golikov's first instinct was to counterattack, to strike back with whatever forces remained uncommitted, to demonstrate that Soviet arms would not accept this reversal without fighting response. But even as he formulated orders, reality intruded with uncomfortable questions. Counterattack with what forces? The mobile reserves had been committed to exploitation, scattered across hundreds of kilometers of captured territory. The artillery that might have stopped the German advance was still moving forward from positions it had occupied days ago, its transport struggling through snow and ice that made rapid redeployment impossible. The infantry divisions that should have been protecting the flanks were instead holding captured cities, performing occupation duties rather than maintaining combat readiness. The radio operator monitoring tactical frequencies turned from his equipment with a face drained of color, holding a message transcribed in handwriting that shook despite obvious efforts at control. The 15th Tank Corps had ceased to exist as a functioning formation, its commander killed in his vehicle, survivors attempting to break out on foot after abandoning vehicles that had run out of fuel or ammunition. Golikov took the message, read it twice, then set it carefully on the map table, as though its physical weight might somehow be transferred to the paper, rather than pressing down on his chest. 15,000 men, 300 tanks, gone in 4 hours of fighting. The schoolhouse walls, covered with children's artwork that nobody had bothered to remove, created surreal juxtaposition with the unfolding catastrophe. Crayon drawings of farm animals and happy families looked down on officers trying to calculate casualty rates and plan defensive positions. A portrait of Stalin, standard in every public building, regarded the scene with the generalized benevolence of propaganda imagery, utterly disconnected from the reality that Soviet forces were being systematically destroyed by an enemy that was supposed to be in retreat. Golikov felt the weight of that disconnection, the gap between what Moscow believed was happening and what was actually occurring on the frozen steppes of Ukraine. Outside, the sound of artillery grew closer, no longer the distant rumble of someone else's battle, but the immediate thunder of combat approaching the command post itself. German reconnaissance had located the schoolhouse, or perhaps simply knew that Soviet doctrine placed headquarters at predictable distances from front lines, and now their guns were ranging in with methodical precision that spoke to professional competence rather than lucky guesswork. Shells began impacting in the village surrounding the school, their detonations sending up geysers of frozen earth and building debris, each explosion a reminder that the front line was no longer a line, but a fluid nightmare where safety existed nowhere. The decision to relocate came not from careful consideration, but from the immediate necessity of survival. Officers gathered maps and documents with the haste of men who understood that minutes mattered, that staying too long transformed command posts into tombs. Radio equipment was already being loaded into trucks by technicians who worked with the efficiency of repeated practice, muscle memory taking over when conscious thought slowed to treacle under stress. Golikov took a final look at the map table, at the red arrows that had represented such confidence 24 hours earlier, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the war. The enemy was not beaten. Perhaps the enemy had never been beaten. Perhaps Stalingrad had been anomaly rather than harbinger. The convoy pulled out of the village just as German artillery shifted from ranging fire to sustained bombardment, shells walking through the streets with demolition efficiency. The schoolhouse took a direct hit seconds after the last vehicle cleared the village perimeter, its roof collapsing inward in a cascade of timber and tile that buried the map table and its obsolete assessments under rubble. Golikov, watching through the rear window of his staff car as the building disintegrated, registered the symbolism with the detached portion of his mind that remained capable of observation, despite the crisis consuming the analytical part. The old plan was dead. The new reality had arrived with explosive announcement. The German advance continued with momentum that seemed unstoppable, each hour bringing new penetrations, fresh disasters, additional units cut off or destroyed. The SS Panzer divisions led the assault with intensity that mixed professional skill with ideological fervor, their commanders driving forward with aggressive initiative that exploited every Soviet mistake, every gap in the line, every moment of hesitation. These were not the cautious attacks of an army husbanding strength, but the confident thrusts of formations that sensed victory and pursued it with predatory focus. Tigers and Panzer IVs rolled across the landscape like medieval siege engines, their guns traversing to destroy targets that appeared and disappeared in the winter haze, each kill adding to a tally that would be measured not in dozens, but in hundreds. Soviet tank crews, those who survived the initial onslaught and managed to organize defensive positions, fought with the desperation of men who understood that defeat meant death or capture. Neither option acceptable. T-34s that had advanced so confidently days earlier now hunkered in hull-down positions, trying to use terrain and concealment to offset the German advantages in gunnery and armor protection. Some succeeded, scoring kills against enemy vehicles that had grown overconfident, reminding the Wehrmacht that Soviet forces could still bite even when on the defensive. But these were temporary victories in a losing battle, individual successes that did nothing to alter the strategic catastrophe unfolding across the front. The Luftwaffe, which had been conspicuously absent from the skies during the Soviet advance, now reappeared with strength that shocked troops who had grown accustomed to operating without aerial opposition. Stuka dive bombers materialized from the gray overcast like shrieking predators, their distinctive sirens announcing death from above as they rolled into attack runs against Soviet columns. The sound alone was weapon enough to break morale, that rising scream as the aircraft plunged toward targets, knowing that somewhere in that dive a bomb was being released, that impact was seconds away, that survival was matter of luck rather than skill. The attacks concentrated on supply routes, the long, vulnerable lines of trucks and horse-drawn wagons that connected forward units to rear area depots. Each destroyed convoy represented not just immediate loss of material, but degradation of capability, fewer shells for guns, less fuel for tanks, reduced rations for infantry. Luftwaffe pilots, flying mission after mission in weather that grounded less determined airmen, turned the roads into graveyards where burned-out vehicles marked the death throes of Soviet logistics. Drivers who survived initial attacks abandoned their trucks and fled on foot, preferring the risk of freezing to the certainty of burning. The psychological impact of renewed German air superiority multiplied the physical damage. Soviet soldiers, looking skyward whenever they heard engine noise, felt the vulnerability of armies without air cover, the nakedness of being exposed to an enemy who could strike from a dimension they couldn't defend against. Infantry that moved by day took casualties from strafing runs that turned snow red. Artillery batteries trying to establish firing positions found themselves attacked before they could unlimber guns. Command posts were bombed, communication centers destroyed. The entire nervous system of military operations disrupted by attacks that seemed to come without warning and leave without pursuit. By the evening of February 19th, the German penetration had achieved depth that transformed tactical success into operational breakthrough. The pincers, driving toward convergence, had carved through Soviet defenses like heated wire through wax, separating forward units from rear echelons, cutting communication lines, creating chaos that prevented organized response. Soviet formations that should have been coordinating defensive actions instead operated in isolation, unaware of what was happening to adjacent units, unable to request support from artillery that had been overrun or commanders who had been killed. The encirclement forming around the 3rd Tank Army represented textbook execution of mobile warfare doctrine, the kind of operation that would be studied in military academies for decades as example of how to destroy enemy forces through maneuver rather than attrition. German units advancing from south and north linked up during the night, their meeting closing the cauldron around Soviet forces that numbered in the tens of thousands. Within this pocket, Soviet commanders faced impossible choices: attempt breakout and risk destruction in open terrain, establish defensive perimeter and hope for relief that might never come, continue fighting and accept gradual annihilation. None of the options offered hope of victory, only varying degrees of catastrophe. The SS Totenkopf Division, operating on the northern shoulder of the encirclement, earned reputation for brutality that exceeded even the Eastern Front's savage norms. Their advance left behind evidence of summary executions, Soviet prisoners shot rather than processed, wounded soldiers killed rather than evacuated. The division's very name, Death's Head, reflected an ethos that treated warfare as ideological crusade rather than military necessity, that saw enemy soldiers not as fellow humans in unfortunate circumstances, but as subhuman obstacles to be eliminated with maximum efficiency. Reports filtering back to German headquarters documented atrocities with bureaucratic precision. Prisoners executed in batches, wounded denied medical care. Villages suspected of harboring partisans burned with their inhabitants. These reports generated no rebuke from higher command, no orders to moderate behavior, only tacit approval through studied silence. The SS divisions were achieving their objectives, destroying Soviet forces with impressive speed, and in the calculus of total war, methods mattered less than results. Besides, the Eastern Front had long since abandoned any pretense of civilized warfare. This was existential struggle between incompatible ideologies, and in such struggles, Geneva Conventions became quaint artifacts of a more innocent age. Soviet soldiers captured by Totenkopf faced grim odds of survival. The division maintained minimal prisoner handling facilities, preferring to eliminate captives rather than divert resources to their care. Those prisoners who were retained found themselves in conditions that killed through deliberate neglect rather than immediate execution. Exposure, starvation, untreated wounds taking their toll over hours or days rather than seconds. The few survivors who eventually made it to regular Wehrmacht prison camps carried stories that would become part of the division's dark legend, accounts of cruelty that mixed sadism with systematic application of Nazi racial ideology. The brutality was not entirely one-sided. Soviet forces, when they managed to capture German soldiers, sometimes responded with their own atrocities, revenge for occupied territories and murdered civilians, payback for the brutalization that Wehrmacht and SS forces had inflicted on Soviet populations. Bodies were found mutilated, prisoners killed after surrendering, wounded finished off in their positions. The Eastern Front had become theater where the rules that theoretically govern warfare had been suspended by mutual unspoken agreement, where both sides committed acts they would later deny or justify, where the distinction between soldier and war criminal blurred beyond recognition. But the Germans held the immediate advantage in this exchange of horrors because they controlled the battlefield, because their forces were advancing rather than retreating, because victors write immediate reports while the defeated focus on survival. The tally of Soviet prisoners grew with each passing hour, hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Men who had begun the month as conquerors and now huddled in improvised detention areas, wondering if they would survive to see home again. German guards, many of them barely older than teenagers, watched over these masses with the mixture of contempt and fear that conquerors feel toward the conquered, knowing that in other circumstances the roles might easily be reversed. February 20th dawned on a front transformed beyond recognition from 48 hours previous. What had been Soviet offensive had become German counteroffensive. What had been German retreat had revealed itself as tactical repositioning. What had been confident Soviet advance had crystallized into encircled disaster. The maps in Soviet headquarters, redrawn continuously to reflect deteriorating situation, showed pockets and salients and penetrations, a geometry of defeat that generated orders increasingly divorced from reality. Moscow demanded counterattacks that couldn't be mounted. Stalin, informed of the crisis by subordinates who understood that bearing bad news to the vozhd carried personal risk, responded with disbelief that morphed into rage when repeated reports confirmed the catastrophe's reality. Golikov, operating from his relocated command post in a farmhouse basement, confronted the impossibility of his position. He lacked forces to counterattack effectively, lacked supplies to sustain defensive operations, lacked mobility to conduct strategic withdrawal before the German pincers completed their encirclement. His best divisions were trapped in pockets where they would be destroyed piecemeal. His logistics infrastructure had been shattered by air attack and armored penetration. His communication with higher headquarters functioned sporadically, radio transmissions interrupted by German jamming or atmospheric conditions or equipment failure. He was commanding an army that was ceasing to exist as coherent force, transforming into a collection of isolated units, fighting individual battles without coordination or mutual support. The psychological weight of this realization manifested physically. Golikov felt his chest tighten, his breathing becoming conscious effort rather than automatic function, the stress of command during catastrophe taking toll that no amount of experience could fully prepare for. His staff looked to him for decisions that might salvage something from disaster, for orders that would demonstrate continued control over events spiraling beyond control. But what decisions existed when every option led to further loss? What orders made sense when the enemy held all advantages and time worked against every Soviet plan? He drafted a message to Moscow describing the situation with honesty that might cost him his position or his freedom or his life. Stalin's tolerance for failure being measured in terms that made military setback potentially career-ending or worse. The Germans had achieved complete surprise. Soviet forces were overextended and undersupplied. The counteroffensive had shattered 3 armies and threatened to destroy 2 more. Immediate reinforcement was essential, but probably impossible given the speed of German advance. Withdrawal was necessary, but might be too late given the encirclements already forming. The message concluded with the bald admission that the situation was critical and deteriorating. Golikov signed it, handed it to his communications officer, and felt a strange relief that comes from having acknowledged catastrophe openly rather than trying to conceal it behind optimistic fiction. The German advance toward Kharkov began as exploitation of success rather than planned objective. But as Manstein monitored the situation from his headquarters, the symbolic value of retaking the city became increasingly apparent. Kharkov had been Germany's to lose and Soviet Russia's to win. Its recapture would not only restore German control over strategically vital transportation hub, but would also provide psychological victory to counter Stalingrad's trauma. The Wehrmacht needed proof that it could still win, that the Eastern Front was not simply long retreat punctuated by disasters. Kharkov offered that proof. Orders went out to redirect forces toward the city, to shift from encirclement operations to direct assault, to transform tactical success into strategic symbol. The units selected for this mission understood the stakes. Kharkov would be contested, its defenders fighting with the desperation of men who knew that losing the city meant admitting that Soviet liberation had been temporary, that German power could reassert itself even after catastrophic defeat. The fighting would be urban and therefore brutal, house-to-house combat that favored defenders and generated casualties at rates that made field commanders wince. Soviet forces remaining in Kharkov received orders to hold at all costs, the phrase that military commanders use when they mean fight to the death, when strategic considerations override tactical common sense. The city's garrison, reinforced by stragglers from broken units and local militia volunteers, prepared defensive positions with the thoroughness of men who understood they were not leaving alive unless they defeated the assault. Buildings were fortified, streets were barricaded, anti-tank guns were positioned at intersections. The city that had changed hands multiple times during the war was about to become battlefield yet again. The civilians caught in this approaching maelstrom faced impossible choices. Those who had celebrated Soviet liberation weeks earlier now confronted the prospect of German return, knowing that occupation forces would view them as potential partisans or collaborators with the Soviets. Many who had the means fled eastward, joining refugee columns that clogged roads and competed with military traffic for scarce resources. Those who lacked transport or couldn't abandon homes remained, hiding in cellars and hoping that somehow the battle would spare them, that they might survive in the gaps between combatants, that luck or prayer might keep them alive through what was coming. February 21st brought German forces to Kharkov's outskirts, reconnaissance elements probing defenses, while main assault formations assembled for coordinated attack. The city, viewed through field glasses from German observation posts, looked like organism preparing to resist invasion. Smoke from defensive fires, movement of troops between positions, the flash of artillery positioned for counter-battery work. Soviet defenders had used the brief respite since liberation to improve positions that Germans had abandoned, turning the city into something approaching fortress. Taking it would require the kind of assault that consumed lives wholesale, that measured progress in meters rather than kilometers, that tested unit cohesion and soldier morale in ways that open-field warfare never matched. The assault began at dawn on February 26, German artillery preparation walking through defensive zones with systematic thoroughness, each barrage targeting positions identified by reconnaissance or revealed by previous probing attacks. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes, longer than doctrine usually recommended, but necessary given the strength of Soviet preparations. Shells demolished buildings, cratered streets, destroyed prepared positions, filled the air with dust and smoke that reduced visibility to meters. When the barrage lifted, infantry and armor moved forward together, the coordination between arms that German doctrine emphasized, allowing them to support each other through the killing zones that urban warfare created. Soviet defenders, deafened by the bombardment and disoriented by its violence, nonetheless rallied to resist the assault with determination that impressed even the attackers. Machine guns opened fire from concealed positions. Anti-tank guns engaged German armor at point-blank range. Infantry with Molotov cocktails attempted close assaults on vehicles that had penetrated too far without adequate support. The fighting immediately took on the character that urban combat always possessed: intimate, vicious, no front lines, every room potentially containing enemies, every corner a potential ambush. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division, assigned the mission of capturing central Kharkov, pushed into the city with aggression that generated casualties on both sides at rates that shocked junior officers unfamiliar with urban warfare's arithmetic. Each block required separate assault. Each building needed to be cleared room by room. Defenders who survived initial attacks retreated to upper floors or cellars and continued fighting, forcing attackers to secure every space before moving forward. Progress measured itself not in the kilometers that characterized mobile warfare, but in dozens of meters gained through hours of sustained combat. German tactical doctrine emphasized combined arms integration even in urban terrain, using tanks to destroy strong points that infantry couldn't reduce with organic weapons, while infantry cleared spaces that tanks couldn't enter. The system worked when coordination held, when communication functioned, when units maintained contact with adjacent formations. But urban warfare disrupted coordination, severed communications, isolated units from their neighbors. Firefights erupted in streets where neither side had clear picture of overall situation, where battle devolved into collection of small unit actions that higher command could monitor but not effectively control. Soviet defenders used the city's architecture to their advantage, channeling German attacks into killing zones, using ruins and rubble to create obstacles that forced armor into predictable routes where anti-tank weapons waited. When positions became untenable, they withdrew to secondary defensive lines that had been prepared in advance, trading space for time, forcing Germans to repeat assault process for each defended zone. This defense in depth, executed despite the chaos and communication breakdown, demonstrated that Soviet forces could still fight effectively when properly led and adequately supplied, that German tactical superiority was real but not insurmountable. The civilian population, trapped in the combat zone, experienced warfare in its most immediate and horrific form. Artillery shells that missed military targets killed families in their homes. Stray bullets penetrated walls and took lives randomly. Buildings collapsed on people sheltering in basements. Those who attempted to flee across the battle lines were shot by both sides, either mistaken for infiltrators or killed because distinguishing civilian from combatant in urban combat was nearly impossible. Bodies accumulated in streets, on stairways, in rooms, evidence of war's indiscriminate harvest when civilians and soldiers occupied the same space. The fighting continued through February 23rd without decisive resolution, Germans making incremental progress while Soviets contested every gain, neither side able to achieve breakthrough that would collapse the other's defense. Casualties mounted on both sides. German medical stations filled with wounded, whose injuries reflected urban combat's particular horrors. Soviet aid posts struggled with casualties they lacked supplies to treat. The city itself suffered damage that would take years to repair. Historic buildings reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, the accumulated evidence of civilization scraped away by military necessity. Manstein, monitoring reports from Kharkov, weighed the tactical cost against strategic gain. The city was being taken but at expense that raised questions about sustainability. His forces had achieved remarkable success in the initial counteroffensive, shattering Soviet armies and recapturing territory. But armies that advance continuously eventually exhaust themselves, even victorious armies, especially in conditions that tested endurance and wore down equipment. The question was whether to continue the offensive until stopped by enemy resistance or logistical constraints, or to halt while still strong and consolidate gains. It was the eternal tension in military operations, balancing exploitation against overextension, knowing that the line between bold and reckless could only be identified in retrospect. For now, the decision was to continue. Kharkov would be taken. Soviet forces would be pursued until pursuit became counterproductive. The Wehrmacht had demonstrated that Stalingrad had not broken its back, that German arms could still achieve decisive victory, that the Eastern Front was not decided. Whether this victory represented last gasp of dying war machine or genuine restoration of German fortunes would be determined by events yet to unfold. But in the moment, in the smoke and fire and death of Kharkov streets, the answer seemed clear. Germany could still win battles. Whether it could win the war remained open question, but battles were what soldiers fought, and this battle, bloody as it was, belonged to the Wehrmacht. The Soviet 40th Army's remnants, those units that had escaped initial encirclement and maintained some organizational coherence, faced the grim mathematics of continued resistance versus withdrawal. Every hour spent fighting in Kharkov was an hour that allowed more of their comrades in the encircled pockets to be destroyed. Every soldier killed defending the city was soldier unavailable for the reorganization that would be necessary once the immediate crisis passed. Yet orders from Moscow emphasized holding Kharkov at all costs, the political leadership apparently believing that symbolic significance justified tactical sacrifice. Division commanders, meeting in cellars while the battle raged overhead, discussed options and voices kept low, not from fear of German listening devices, but from awareness that what they contemplated bordered on insubordination. The situation was impossible. Supplies were nearly exhausted. Casualties had reduced some battalions to company strength. German forces were not just at the gates but inside the city, expanding their foothold with methodical violence. Continuing to fight meant certain destruction. Withdrawing meant court-martial or worse. The choice between death in battle and death by firing squad felt like no choice at all. One colonel, his uniform still bearing the dust of a building collapse that had nearly killed him hours earlier, articulated what others were thinking but hesitant to say aloud. We can die here for nothing, or we can withdraw and perhaps fight again somewhere the terrain favors defense. The others looked at him with expressions that mixed agreement with fear, knowing that speaking such thoughts represented the first step toward making them real, toward committing to action that could not be undone. The decision, when it came, emerged from collective acknowledgement rather than formal vote. They would withdraw. Orders would be issued claiming authorization from higher command, trusting that chaos would prevent immediate verification, gambling that survival would prove more valuable than rigid adherence to orders that made no military sense. Messengers went out to subordinate units with instructions to begin disengagement after dark, to move east under cover of darkness, to abandon the city that had been liberated and defended, and now must be surrendered to preserve forces for fights yet to come. February 24th brought confusion to Kharkov as Soviet forces implemented their unauthorized withdrawal, while German forces intensified assault, unaware that defenders were already slipping away. Combat continued in sectors where Soviet units maintained positions to cover the retreat, rearguard actions that bought time measured in hours and paid for in lives. German commanders, sensing weakening resistance, pressed attacks with renewed vigor, believing they were breaking the defense through sustained pressure rather than pushing on door that was already opening. By dawn on February 25th, the truth became apparent. Large sections of the city stood empty of defenders, positions abandoned, weapons too heavy to carry left behind, evidence of hasty departure scattered across defensive zones. German infantry, advancing cautiously into areas that should have been contested, found themselves moving through ghost town. The eerie silence of spaces recently occupied, but now emptied of human presence. The withdrawal had been executed with competence that surprised German intelligence officers analyzing the operation later. Despite communication difficulties and organizational chaos, Soviet forces had managed disengagement that saved thousands of soldiers from encirclement. Manstein received the news with mixed feelings. The city was falling into German hands more easily than expected, which was tactically beneficial. But the escape of significant Soviet forces meant they would reconstitute elsewhere, would require defeating again in future operations, represented unfinished business that prolonged the campaign. The ideal outcome would have been complete encirclement and destruction, achieving level of damage that prevented reconstitution. Instead, the victory at Kharkov would be real but incomplete, significant but not decisive. The German flag was raised over Kharkov City Hall on March 14, 1943, the culmination of offensive that had begun 3 weeks earlier with counterattack that shattered Soviet advance. The ceremony was brief, no triumphalism beyond what military necessity required. Senior officers aware that victory had come at costs that made celebration seem inappropriate. The city itself lay in ruins, damage from previous battles compounded by the recent fighting. Thousands of soldiers, German and Soviet, lay dead in streets and buildings and improvised graves. Tens of thousands more had been wounded, their recovery uncertain, their return to combat doubtful. The civilians who emerged from shelters after the fighting ended faced city transformed into landscape of destruction. Buildings they had known since childhood were rubble. Streets they had walked daily were cratered and blocked. Services that made urban life possible, water, electricity, heat, were disrupted or destroyed. The occupation that followed would be different from the liberation that had preceded it. German authorities suspicious of population that had welcomed Soviet forces, ready to punish collaboration, real or imagined, prepared to extract resources that city could ill afford to provide. For the soldiers who had fought the battle, German and Soviet alike, Kharkov became memory that would stay with them however long they survived the war. The Germans would remember it as proof that Wehrmacht could still win, could still execute complex operations successfully, could still impose its will on enemy forces. The Soviets would remember it as lesson in hubris, as demonstration that confidence unsupported by logistical reality led to disaster, as reminder that enemy must never be underestimated regardless of recent victories. The broader implications of Manstein's counteroffensive extended beyond Kharkov to reshape understanding of the Eastern Front's trajectory. After Stalingrad, many observers had concluded that Germany's defeat was inevitable, that the resource advantages enjoyed by Soviet Union, combined with Wehrmacht's degraded combat power, made continued German resistance futile. Kharkov challenged that narrative, demonstrating that tactical excellence could still achieve significant victories even when strategic outlook remained grim. The war would continue, perhaps for years, because both sides retained capability to hurt each other badly enough that negotiated settlement seemed preferable to continued fighting. The human cost of this continuation would be measured in millions of additional casualties, in cities destroyed and populations displaced, in the accumulated trauma of total war prosecuted without mercy or limitation. The soldiers fighting in Kharkov's ruins during those February and March days could not know the full scale of what was coming, could not envision the battles yet to be fought, could not anticipate that the war would consume another 2 years and generate suffering that would make current horrors seem almost modest by comparison. They knew only their immediate circumstances: the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, the fear, the brief moments of camaraderie between people facing shared danger. For Golikov, the aftermath of the disaster meant relief from command, the fate of Soviet generals who failed regardless of circumstances. He was recalled to Moscow to face inquiry into how 3 armies had been shattered, how offensive had transformed into rout, how victory had become defeat. The fact that he had been following orders, advancing as directed, pursuing objectives set by higher authority, mattered less than the outcome. Someone had to bear responsibility for catastrophe, and in Soviet system, that someone was rarely the person who had issued the orders, rather than the person who had failed to execute them successfully. Manstein's reputation, already significant, was enhanced by the counteroffensive's success. He had demonstrated that German military leadership still possessed capacity for operational brilliance, that Wehrmacht remained a dangerous opponent capable of achieving decisive results when properly led and adequately resourced. Hitler, desperate for positive news after Stalingrad's disaster, seized on Kharkov as validation that his decision to continue fighting in East was justified, that eventual victory remained possible if only generals showed sufficient will and determination. The fact that Manstein's success had come through accepting temporary retreat, through trading space for advantage, through violating Hitler's standing orders against withdrawal, got conveniently overlooked in celebration of outcome. The spring Rasputitsa, the mud season that made military operations nearly impossible in Ukraine, was approaching. Both sides would use the pause to reorganize, to absorb lessons from recent fighting, to prepare for summer campaigns. The Germans would plan their offensive at Kursk, the massive armored assault that would represent Wehrmacht's last gasp of offensive capability in the east. The Soviets would prepare defenses in depth designed to bleed German armor white, to transform enemy attack into killing ground, to demonstrate that lessons of Kharkov had been absorbed and would not be repeated. But that lay in the future, in the present, in the ruins of Kharkov and the frozen fields surrounding it. The snow was beginning to melt, revealing what winter had concealed. Bodies emerged from drifts where they had been buried or abandoned. Destroyed vehicles shed their white camouflage to reveal the twisted metal underneath. The landscape of war, which snow had made clean and almost beautiful in its terrible way, became ugly again as spring approached, as the truth of what had happened became visible in ways that winter had mercifully obscured. The weeks between late February and mid-March transformed Kharkov into a laboratory for studying how cities die. Not the sudden death of aerial bombardment that erased neighborhoods in minutes, but the slow strangulation of urban warfare, where buildings fell brick by brick, where streets were contested meter by meter, where the infrastructure that made civilization possible was severed one utility at a time. Water pipes froze and burst, their contents flooding basements where families sheltered. Gas lines ruptured, filling enclosed spaces with fumes that killed silently before anyone noticed danger. Electrical systems failed, plunging districts into darkness that made night operations treacherous for attackers and defenders alike. The city was dying, and 20,000 people were trapped inside watching it happen. Maria Kovalenko, a schoolteacher who had remained in her apartment despite having multiple opportunities to evacuate, kept journal during these weeks that would later provide historians with civilian perspective on urban combat. Her entries, written in margins of children's notebooks because proper paper had long since been exhausted, documented the degradation of daily life with precision that contrasted sharply with the chaos she described. February 26. No water for 3 days now. We melt snow in pots, but there is never enough and it tastes of smoke. The fighting on Sumskaya Street continued all night. February 28th. The Petrovs in apartment 4B are dead. A shell came through their kitchen window while they were eating. March 10th. I saw German soldiers shoot a man who was carrying a white flag. They searched his body and took his boots. Her building, a 4-story apartment block constructed in the 1930s with the optimistic solidity of Soviet architecture, sat 4 blocks from what had become the main line of German advance. This proximity made it valuable as observation post, firing position, command center, depending on which army currently controlled it. Soviet forces had used the roof for machine gun nests until German mortar fire made that position untenable. German infantry had briefly occupied the ground floor until Soviet counterattack drove them out in fighting that left the entry hall decorated with blood that froze into dark patterns on the tile. Now the building existed in no man's land, technically belonging to neither side, practically serving as shelter for civilians who had nowhere else to go, and soldiers from both armies who sought temporary refuge from combat. The residents who remained, perhaps 30 people from the original 90, had developed unofficial protocols for coexisting with military occupation. When Soviet soldiers appeared, they offered what little food remained and asked for nothing in return, understanding that appearing too welcoming to either side created suspicion from the other. When Germans came through, they maintained neutral expressions and responded to questions with minimal information, aware that enthusiasm or hostility could be equally dangerous. The soldiers, for their part, generally treated the civilians with indifference rather than active malice, too exhausted by continuous combat to waste energy on people who posed no immediate threat. But rules that worked most of the time failed catastrophically on occasion. March 4th brought squad of SS troops searching the building for suspected Soviet infiltrators, their methodology involving kicking in every door and treating occupants as hostile until proven otherwise. They found Yevgeny Sokolov, a 48-year-old factory worker who had been drafted into local militia the previous month, hiding in a closet still wearing remnants of his uniform. The SS's Untersturmführer leading the squad asked no questions, made no attempt to determine if Sokolov was active combatant or deserter or simply man trying to survive. The burst of submachine gun fire that killed him also wounded his wife, who died 3 hours later because the building lacked medical supplies and German soldiers refused to allow anyone to leave seeking help. Maria documented this in her journal with handwriting that shook visibly on the page. They murdered him. There is no other word. He was not fighting. He was hiding. And they shot him like an animal, and her too. And then they left the bodies in the apartment and told us not to touch them. We can hear them in there, or we imagine we can. The smell's certainly real enough. March has brought no spring, only more death. The pattern repeated across Kharkov in variations that differed in detail but shared essential horror. Civilians accused of signaling Soviet positions were executed without trial. Families suspected of hiding Red Army soldiers were killed collectively. Buildings where resistance had occurred were cleared by methods that made no distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Grenades tossed into rooms without checking occupancy. Flamethrowers used in enclosed spaces that killed everyone inside. The SS divisions operated with impunity derived from ideological conviction that Eastern populations were racially inferior and therefore expendable. That collateral damage was acceptable price for military efficiency. that anyone who died was probably guilty of something, even if specific crime couldn't be identified. Soviet forces, when they controlled territory, demonstrated their own capacity for brutality, though generally directed it more selectively. Suspected collaborators faced summary justice that involved minimal investigation and maximum publicity, bodies left hanging from lampposts with signs identifying their alleged crimes. Anyone who had cooperated with German occupation, whether voluntarily through ideological sympathy or involuntarily through coercion, faced retribution that recognized no gradations between active collaboration and passive compliance. The population learned to dread liberation almost as much as occupation, knowing that either could bring death depending on what authorities believed they had done during the other side's control. The combat itself ground through March with mechanical inevitability, neither side able to achieve breakthrough that would collapse the other's defense, both continuing to feed men and material into urban meat grinder that consumed them without producing decisive result. German advantages in training and equipment mattered less in an environment where visibility was measured in meters, and engagements occurred at ranges where riflemen could be as effective as tank. Soviet defenders used their knowledge of urban terrain to create killing zones that channeled German advances into predictable routes, then devastated those routes with prepositioned weapons and improvised obstacles that turned streets into graves. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division lost 3 battalion commanders in 5 days of urban combat, officers killed by snipers or caught in ambushes, or simply unlucky enough to be in buildings that collapsed under artillery fire. Their replacements, promoted from company command with inadequate preparation, learned on the job or died trying. Casualty rates among junior officers and NCOs reached levels that threatened unit cohesion, the experienced leadership being stripped away faster than replacements could be trained, institutional knowledge bleeding out with every killed sergeant or wounded lieutenant. Soviet forces suffered equivalent or worse losses, but could afford them less. The Red Army's advantage had always been manpower, the ability to replace casualties from seemingly inexhaustible reserves. But reserves meant nothing to soldiers trapped in Kharkov, cut off from reinforcement, watching their formations shrink with each passing day. A Soviet rifle company that had entered the city with 120 men might be down to 40 by mid-March, its survivors amalgamated with other depleted units to form composite formations that lacked organic cohesion and fought with the desperation of men who knew replacement was impossible. The civilians trapped in this grinding horror existed in state of suspended animation between life and death, their survival dependent on factors beyond their control or comprehension. Artillery shells obeyed ballistic trajectories that cared nothing for innocence. Bullets traveled paths determined by physics rather than justice. Buildings collapsed according to structural mechanics that made no distinction between the guilty and the merely unlucky. Each morning that residents of Kharkov woke alive was minor miracle. Each evening they survived another data point in odds that grew progressively worse. Food became memory rather than reality. The stored supplies and emergency reserves long since consumed, leaving population to subsist on whatever could be scavenged from ruined buildings or bartered from soldiers. A can of meat became treasure worth risking death to obtain. A loaf of bread could purchase safety for a night or betrayal for an hour, depending on who was hungry and what they were willing to do. Children cried from hunger that parents couldn't relieve, their wailing a soundtrack to urban warfare that matched the percussion of artillery and the staccato of small arms fire. The breaking point, when it came, arrived not from single dramatic event, but from accumulated weight of impossibility. By March 10th, Soviet commanders still holding positions in Kharkov understood that further resistance served no military purpose. Their forces were combat ineffective, supplies exhausted, casualties irreplaceable. German control of the city was inevitable. The only questions were timing and cost. Holding 3 more days might allow encircled forces elsewhere to attempt breakout. It might also result in complete destruction of the Kharkov garrison. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Colonel Dmitry Belov, commanding a composite regiment formed from survivors of 3 different divisions, made the calculation in his command post located in a theater basement. His forces numbered perhaps 800 effectives out of original strength that had exceeded 4,000. His ammunition reserves would support perhaps 6 more hours of sustained combat. His casualty clearing station had run out of morphine, bandages, disinfectant, everything except volunteers willing to comfort dying men with presents and lies about survival. Continuing to fight meant dying in place. Withdrawing meant court-martial if he survived to face it. The choice felt less like decision than acknowledgement of reality already determined by circumstances. He drafted orders for withdrawal to begin after nightfall, each word feeling like betrayal of soldiers who had died holding positions he was now ordering abandoned. The military language, retrograde movement, tactical adjustment, force preservation, disguised the essential truth that he was ordering retreat without authorization, gambling that chaos would prevent immediate discovery and eventual victory would provide retroactive justification. His hands shook slightly as he signed the order, not from fear exactly, but from awareness that he was crossing line between following commands and making independent judgment that contradicted superior orders. The withdrawal began at 2300 hours on March 11th, units disengaging under cover of darkness and remaining artillery fire that was concentrated to suggest continued defensive operations rather than preparation for evacuation. Soldiers moved through streets they had fought to control, abandoning positions they had bled to hold, carrying wounded who couldn't walk and leaving dead who couldn't be moved. The procession had quality of funeral march, men departing place where comrades had fallen, knowing they were surrendering ground those comrades had died defending. German forces, initially confused by patterns of fire that suggested continued resistance in sectors that were actually being evacuated, took hours to recognize what was happening. By the time assault elements probed forward and discovered abandoned positions, Soviet rearguards had established new defensive lines further east, buying time for main body to increase distance from pursuing enemy. The withdrawal achieved what military professionals call successful disengagement. Forces extracted from combat with tactical integrity maintained, avoiding rout or destruction in detail. But success measured against worst possible outcome still felt like defeat. Still carried taste of failure regardless of professional competence demonstrated in execution. The civilians left behind faced uncertain fate that depended on which German units occupied their neighborhoods and what mood those units were in when they arrived. Some districts saw a relatively benign occupation, Wehrmacht soldiers who treated remaining population with indifference rather than hostility, who requisitioned supplies through formal procedures rather than simple theft, who maintained discipline that prevented atrocities. Other areas experienced the SS at their worst, systematic looting followed by violence that seemed recreational rather than necessary, cruelty inflicted because ideology permitted it and commanders encouraged it and unit culture celebrated it. Maria Kovalenko survived by hiding in her building's coal cellar for 3 days, emerging only after German occupation had stabilized sufficiently that random violence became less likely. She found her city transformed into landscapes she barely recognized. Familiar streets were impassable with rubble. Landmarks that had oriented her entire life were demolished. Neighbors she had known for years were dead or missing or forever changed by what they had witnessed and endured. Her journal entry for March 15th consisted of a single sentence. "We are alive, but I'm not sure that's better than the alternative." Private Anton Weiss, a Wehrmacht infantryman who had fought through every day of the Kharkov operation, would later write in letters home, intercepted and filed by military censors, about what victory felt like from a foxhole perspective. "We have taken the city, and they say this is great triumph. But I have seen enough dead friends to know that triumph is word used by generals who were not here when Schmidt caught shrapnel in his throat, or when the basement on Pushkin Street collapsed on 3rd Platoon. We won. I am alive." These facts seem unrelated. His testimony, buried in archives for decades, captured what official histories could not. That tactical success measured by map markers bore little resemblance to the experience of individuals who had purchased that success with trauma they would carry until death. The final tally of Kharkov's battle defied precise calculation because record-keeping had collapsed along with everything else. Soviet forces lost somewhere between 25 and 40,000 killed, with additional tens of thousands wounded or captured. German casualties were lighter but still significant, perhaps 8,000 dead and 20,000 wounded across the various formations involved in the offensive. Civilian deaths numbered at least 5,000, possibly twice that, the true figure unknowable, because many bodies were never recovered or identified, buried under collapsed buildings or consumed by fires, or simply lost in chaos that prevented systematic accounting. Equipment losses were staggering. The Red Army left behind more than 600 tanks, destroyed or abandoned when fuel ran out or mechanical failures made them immobile. Artillery pieces numbering in hundreds were lost, some destroyed by crews that lacked transport to evacuate them, others captured intact when Soviet positions were overrun before destruction could be accomplished. Thousands of vehicles, from trucks to staff cars to motorcycles, were scattered across the battlefield, testimony to logistical collapse that had transformed Mobile Army into foot-bound refugees. For the German forces, victory at Kharkov represented validation after Stalingrad's trauma, proof that Wehrmacht retained capability to achieve significant success even against numerically superior enemy. Manstein's reputation, already substantial, grew to near mythical proportions. He had executed operational masterpiece, achieving results that exceeded reasonable expectations given forces available and circumstances prevailing. The counteroffensive would be studied in military academies for generations as example of how superior generalship could multiply combat power, how maneuver could substitute for mass, how psychological understanding of enemy could be weaponized as effectively as tanks or artillery. But beneath the tactical success lay strategic reality that no amount of brilliant generalship could overcome. Germany was losing the war. Not immediately, not obviously, but inexorably. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Soviet Union could afford losses that would cripple Germany. Soviet industry, relocated beyond the Urals and protected from German air attack, was producing tanks and artillery at rates that exceeded German capacity to destroy them. Soviet manpower reserves, though depleted by 2 years of catastrophic casualties, still numbered in millions. Meanwhile, Germany's industry struggled under Allied bombing. German manpower was stretched across multiple fronts. German fuel supplies were constrained by lack of petroleum and inadequate synthetic production. Manstein understood this, though he rarely articulated it explicitly. In his reports to Hitler and discussions with fellow officers, he maintained facade of confidence about eventual victory, emphasizing what Wehrmacht could still accomplish with proper leadership and adequate resources. But in private moments, in conversations with trusted subordinates, the truth emerged. They could win battles. They could inflict disproportionate casualties. They could demonstrate tactical superiority. But absent political settlement or miracle that fundamentally altered strategic balance, the outcome was predetermined. Germany would lose because its enemies possessed resources it lacked and willed to use those resources regardless of cost. Manstein, promoted and decorated for his success, began planning next operations with awareness that time was not Germany's ally. Every month the strategic situation deteriorated. Every battle consumed resources that couldn't be fully replaced. The war in the East was becoming attritional despite all efforts to maintain mobility and maneuver. Germany was being ground down by enemy who could absorb losses and continue fighting, who treated casualties as acceptable cost of eventual victory, who possessed will to endure that exceeded German capacity to inflict damage. The other German commanders who had executed his plan faced varied fates that reflected the arbitrary nature of survival in total war. General Oberst Hermann Hoth, whose Panzer forces had delivered the southern blow, would continue commanding on the Eastern Front until the war's final year, when Hitler's paranoia about aristocratic generals would see him dismissed. SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, who had led the SS Panzer Corps through the Kharkov operation, would lose an eye in later fighting but survive the war, his military competence never quite erasing the stain of the organization he served. Generals who had protested aspects of the plan, who had urged more caution or different timing, found their careers stagnating regardless of the operation's success. Hitler rewarded obedience more than tactical acumen, and Manstein's independence made others nervous about following his example. The victory had been collective, but in Nazi Germany's toxic command culture, success was claimed by individuals while failure was distributed among scapegoats. creating an environment where battlefield competence mattered less than political positioning. The Soviet high command drew different lessons from Kharkov, though the conclusions were equally bitter. The Red Army had become overconfident after Stalingrad, had advanced too rapidly without securing flanks or maintaining logistical support, had underestimated enemy capacity for counterattack. These were correctable mistakes, tactical and operational errors that better planning and more careful execution could prevent. But correcting them required acknowledging them, which meant critiquing decisions that had been approved at highest levels, which carried political risks in system where admitting error could be career-ending or worse. Stalin, informed of the disaster by subordinates who emphasized factors beyond Soviet control while minimizing command failures, responded with his characteristic mixture of rage and calculation. Someone had to be blamed. Golikov, already relieved of command, became primary scapegoat, his errors magnified while systemic failures were minimized. Other officers faced inquiry or demotion, their careers damaged by association with defeat. The message was clear. Failure would not be tolerated, accountability would be enforced. Victory was not just military objective, but political requirement. For Golikov, the aftermath of the disaster meant relief from command. The fate of Soviet generals who failed regardless of circumstances. He was recalled to Moscow to face inquiry into how three armies had been shattered, how offensive had transformed into rout, how victory had become defeat. Unlike many of his peers who faced such tribunals, Golikov would survive, his political connections and previous successes purchasing clemency where others found only accusations of treason and sentences carried out in basement cells. He would serve in diminished roles for the war's remainder, his career effectively ended, but his life preserved, living testament to the narrow margin between scapegoat and survivor in Stalin's unforgiving system. The fact that he had been following orders, advancing as directed, pursuing objectives set by higher authority, mattered less than the outcome. Someone had to bear responsibility for catastrophe, and in Soviet system, that someone was rarely the person who had issued the orders rather than the person who had failed to execute them successfully. The reforms that followed Kharkov reshaped how Red Army conducted operations, introducing greater caution in offensive planning, more emphasis on logistics and flank security, better coordination between armor and infantry and artillery. These changes were purchased with blood spilled in Ukrainian winter, lessons learned at cost of tens of thousands of casualties. The Soviet military machine, never gentle in how it trained its soldiers, became even more ruthless in weeding out commanders who showed insufficient aggression or excessive caution, who failed to achieve objectives or advanced too rapidly without support. The system demanded success while punishing failure, creating impossible calculus that destroyed careers and lives with equal efficiency. For the soldiers who survived Kharkov, German and Soviet alike, the battle became touchstone memory that would shape how they viewed the rest of the war. German veterans spoke of it as moment when tide turned, when Wehrmacht proved it could still win despite Stalingrad's disaster. Soviet survivors remembered it as harsh lesson in humility, as demonstration that confidence unsupported by preparation led to catastrophe. Both groups carried psychological scars alongside physical wounds, memories of combat so intense that decades later they would wake from dreams of frozen streets and burning buildings and the screams of wounded men. The spring Rasputitsa arrived in late March, transforming Ukraine into impassable mud sea that made large-scale military operations impossible. Both armies used the enforced pause to reorganize, absorb replacements, repair equipment. The front line stabilized roughly where it had been before the Soviet winter offensive began, all the advances and retreats and battles netting out to status quo antebellum. Tens of thousands had died to move lines on maps back to approximately where they started. This was not unusual in modern warfare, where operational movement could be dramatic while strategic situation remained essentially unchanged. But the pause was temporary. Both sides knew that summer would bring renewed operations, that the war was far from over, that Kharkov represented chapter rather than conclusion. German planners were already developing Operation Citadel, the massive armored offensive at Kursk that would represent Wehrmacht's last major attack in the east. Soviet commanders prepared defenses in depth, learning from Kharkov that defense could be more effective than offense when properly prepared. The next act of the Eastern Front's drama would be larger, bloodier, more mechanized than anything seen before. Kharkov would seem almost modest by comparison. The summer of 1943 would bring Kursk, where German armor would break itself against Soviet defenses and never fully recover offensive capability. The strategic initiative would pass permanently to Soviet hands. Wehrmacht would fight defensively for the rest of the war, retreating slowly but steadily westward, bleeding at every step but unable to prevent ultimate defeat. All of this lay ahead, unknowable to soldiers fighting in present but predetermined by mathematics of resource and will. For the civilians of Ukraine, caught between ideologies that both claimed to represent their interests while treating them as expendable resources, the future offered no comfort. German occupation was brutal. Soviet rule was repressive. The war had made their homeland into battleground, where armies clashed without regard for the people who actually lived there, whose villages were burned and crops confiscated, and men conscripted, and women violated, and children orphaned by conflict that served national interests, far removed from daily concerns of ordinary people trying to survive. Maria Kovalenko, resuming her teaching duties in school building that had been converted into makeshift hospital and then abandoned when medical supplies ran out, found her students were different people than they had been months earlier. They had seen things children should never witness. They had lost family members to violence or starvation or disease. They had learned that adults could not protect them, that authority could not guarantee safety, that innocence was luxury that war did not permit. She taught them mathematics and history and grammar with the same dedication she had always shown, but the material felt hollow, disconnected from reality they inhabited. What use was education when the world was ending? Yet she taught anyway, because the alternative was surrender to despair, because maintaining routines was itself a form of resistance, because if the children lost everything else, they should at least keep possibility of future different from present. The German occupation authorities, establishing administration in Kharkov after the military secured the city, faced challenges that no amount of military success could resolve. The city's infrastructure was devastated. The population was hostile. Partisan activity in surrounding countryside threatened supply lines. The economic exploitation that Nazi ideology demanded couldn't be accomplished when factories were destroyed and workers were dead or fled. What they had captured was corpse of city, its industrial value gone, its strategic importance compromised by the damage inflicted during its capture. They held ruins and called it victory. The Wehrmacht divisions that had fought for Kharkov were withdrawn for rest and refit, replaced by security units tasked with maintaining order and suppressing resistance. The SS divisions moved to new sectors, new battles, leaving behind reputation for brutality that would outlast any tactical achievements they had earned. The soldiers who had fought in urban combat carried memories that would never completely fade, nightmares that would wake them decades later, psychological wounds that no military medical system was equipped to treat or even acknowledge. Yet in the moment, in the muddy spring of 1943, the war's outcome remained uncertain enough that both sides continued fighting with belief that victory was possible. The German soldier maintaining his position on Kharkov's outskirts believed his sacrifice served cause that could succeed. The Soviet soldier training for next offensive believed his efforts would contribute to eventual triumph. Both were partially right and partially wrong. Both would kill and die in numbers that made Kharkov seem like preliminary bout before main event. The legacy of Kharkov extended beyond its immediate participants to shape how both sides understood the war. For Germany, it demonstrated that tactical excellence could still achieve success, that Wehrmacht remained a dangerous opponent, that defeatism was premature. These beliefs, while partially justified by evidence, encouraged continuation of war that was already strategically lost, prolonging conflict and multiplying casualties. The ability to win battles became cursed when it prevented recognition that winning battles wasn't enough, that strategic situation demanded political settlement rather than military continuation. For Soviet Union, Kharkov reinforced lessons about German military competence, about danger of underestimating enemy, about importance of logistics and preparation. These were valuable insights that would inform how Red Army fought for rest of war, but they came at price measured in tens of thousands of casualties, in captured territory and lost equipment, in psychological trauma that touched everyone involved. The education was necessary but expensive, purchased with blood and suffering that could never be fully justified by subsequent success. The historians who would later analyze Kharkov would debate its significance, some arguing it was a crucial turning point that delayed German defeat and thereby prolonged war, others maintaining it was tactical footnote to strategic inevitability. Both interpretations contain truth. Manstein's counteroffensive was brilliant execution that achieved remarkable results. It was also ultimately futile, delaying but not preventing outcome determined by factors beyond military control. War is not chess game where tactical excellence guarantees victory. War is brutal contest of wills and resources where strategy matters more than tactics, where endurance outlasts brilliance, where the army that can afford to lose often defeats the army that cannot. The snow that had covered Kharkov during the battle melted in spring warmth, revealing landscape transformed by violence into something barely recognizable as human habitat. Buildings stood as hollow shells, their windows empty sockets staring at nothing. Streets were scarred with craters and littered with debris that would take months to clear. The trees that had lined boulevards were shattered stumps, their branches harvested for firewood or destroyed by explosions. Nature would eventually reclaim what war had devastated. Grass growing over graves, trees sprouting from ruins. The physical evidence of combat slowly eroded by time and weather. But the psychological scars would persist, carried by survivors who would pass trauma to children and grandchildren, embedding the war's horror into cultural memory that would last generations. For the soldiers who fought at Kharkov and survived to see war's end, the battle would occupy complicated space in their memories. German veterans would remember it with pride as example of their military's competence, but that pride would be forever tainted by knowledge of what their army served, what ideologies it implemented, what crimes it committed. Soviet veterans would remember it as painful lesson learned at high cost, but also as step on path to eventual victory, evidence that Red Army could absorb terrible defeats and continue fighting. Neither side's memories were simple or comfortable because war rarely produces memories that are. The civilians who survived carried different burden. They had no ideology to justify their suffering, no national narrative to give meaning to their losses. They had simply endured, survived through luck and caution, and compromises that afterwards seemed shameful. They had watched neighbors killed and done nothing because doing something meant joining them. They had cooperated with whichever army controlled their street because resistance meant death. They had made choices that seemed necessary in moment, but would haunt them in peace. Their stories would be least told, least honored, least understood by populations that preferred narratives of resistance and heroism to uncomfortable truths about survival's moral complexity. The Eastern Front would continue for 2 more years after Kharkov, grinding through millions of additional casualties, devastating cities from Smolensk to Berlin, creating human catastrophe on scale that exceeded comprehension. Kharkov was one battle among hundreds, one city among thousands that suffered under war's weight. But for those who fought there, and those who survived there, and those who died there, it was the entire war condensed into weeks of horror that defined their existence. Their war was not the grand strategic movements that filled history books, but the immediate terror of combat and hunger and cold and loss. Their war was personal and intimate and utterly consuming, leaving scars that maps and casualty statistics could never capture. The lesson of Kharkov, if such horror can be said to teach lessons, was that tactical brilliance cannot overcome strategic reality, that competence in battle cannot substitute for wisdom in policy, that armies that fight superbly for causes that are evil still serve evil regardless of their military prowess. Victory in the wrong war is simply defeat wearing different colors. Manstein was brilliant general serving monstrous regime. His counteroffensive was masterwork of operational art that achieved nothing except prolonging war and multiplying suffering. In war, there are no clean victories, no triumphs without cost, no successes that justify the means used to achieve them. There is only the grinding machinery of violence consuming human lives and calling it necessity.